So, AP World History students, here we are. We've reached the end of the road, the last lesson of new material in our course. Now, we have not gotten everything here in this period from 1900 to the present. We're just sort of chopping through some highlights right now, so I can't say that I've touched on everything I want to touch on, but I know that we have gotten to kind of close up a lot of narrative threads for the year. And I think today is really about closing up the last one about the Cold War, and then really just sort of describing the moment we're in right now, right? So the Cold War comes to an end, globalization begins, and that's where we're going to leave it. That's sort of the last train, or the last stop on the train, and then after that we're going to begin the process next week of really reviewing in earnest, not only for our exam, our unit exam that's coming up, but of course for the national exam. So, learning targets, two pretty straightforward ones. What were the reasons why the Cold War ended? Can you explain that? We'll work on that to begin with. And then the costs and the benefits of globalization, this period of time that we're living in right now. Can we explain what's wonderful about it and what some of the costs are? By the 1980s, the various communist systems in the world were more or less out of gas. And the 1980s would see the total collapse of nearly all of those systems. And this happened for a bunch of reasons. Some reasons that are internal, some reasons that were external. But I think the simplest and safest way to begin is just to say that Soviet system was stagnant. It had depleted itself, it was exhausted, and when they tried to do some incremental or moderate reforms, it didn't work. It ended up just sort of, they lost control of everything. I think the simpler way of saying it is just communism proved to not work, all right? That the notion of like annihilating the individual motivation to work or individual incentive to work completely drained economic vitality out of the system. I mean, that's the simplest way of saying it. We'll look at some of the specific examples here. But the Soviet Union was really under a lot of stress by the late 1970s. They were caught in an ugly, kind of protracted war in Afghanistan, which was ostensibly one of their satellite states that they were losing control of. It was sort of like their version of America's Vietnam War. The United States was entering a period of new economic vitality. The new American president, starting in early 1981, Ronald Reagan. Reagan was an interesting mix of like his rhetoric toward the Soviet Union sort of identified them as an evil empire. That was famously one of the phrases that he used. Politically and practically, he was a little bit more pragmatic, but certainly his approach meant like placing more, if he saw that the Soviet system was strained, he was interested in placing more strains and pressures on them as a way of like ultimately hoping to win the Cold War, which is what would happen by 1989. But really the biggest causes for the collapse of the Soviet system don't have to do with the United States necessarily. They just have to do with the internal decay within the Soviet system, and the fact that a lot of the Soviet satellite states or puppet states were really, really ready to be done with this, right? This had gone on for some 40 years of being under the control of the Soviet Union. And let's name the place where it begins. This is Poland. Poland is really the first of the satellite states to see major momentum toward weakening of the Soviet apparatus. So you see a figure there. His name is Lech Walesa. He's a labor leader actually in the Soviet Union, but he really was kind of a nationalist figure and almost like an independence figure, leading the push against the Soviets. And this is a dangerous move in the Soviet Union. Pope John Paul II was, of course, the head of the Catholic Church, but he was the first non-Italian pope, maybe ever, but certainly in many centuries. And he was from Poland. And he was interesting because he used his kind of like his cultural and moral clout to cast a finger at the Soviet Union and the evils of the Soviet system. Like these two people using their rhetoric, using their influence against the Soviet system, those embolden other places like Czechoslovakia and Hungary, where they are sort of like trying take back inch by inch, piece by piece, a little bit more local control for themselves. The Communist Party in the Soviet system is sort of unsure exactly how to deal with that, right? I mean, do they like bring in the tanks and crack down, or do they sort of let these places have a little bit more leash and a little bit longer leash? Like, how do you exactly respond to this? And so there's like strains are beginning to show in the Soviet system. And then starting in 1985, there's a new premier of the Soviet system, a new kind of president, the head of the Soviet system, and his name is Mikhail Gorbachev. Now, right before him, there had been a succession, and I don't remember the number if it's 3 or 4, each of whom were like came to power in their mid-late 70s, you know, almost decrepit figures who like symbolized the decay of the Soviet system itself, not to read too much into it. But Gorbachev was different, right? Gorbachev was in his early 50s. He was known as a reformer, as a moderate within the communist system. Gorbachev's basic position is we're going to have to give a little bit, right? We're going to have to liberalize. We're going to have to offer people a little bit more individual incentive. We're going to have to offer people a little bit more individual liberties, because if we don't, like, the momentum is building where they're gonna try and pull this whole system down, and he gains a lot of favor in especially in the West. Everyone's like, hey, this is a different sort of figure, and Reagan's looking at him too, like, well, that's very interesting. And Gorbachev comes in, he offers perestroika, which is like limited bits of capitalism, limited opportunities, but some opportunities for individual incentive. This is similar to what Deng is doing in China. And I'd say just putting this in place is acknowledging that, like, when you eliminate individual incentive to like get ahead in work, then people don't work as hard. I mean, he was acknowledging the basic flaws of the whole communist system. And when the public in the Soviet Union and the Soviet satellite states get wind of this, they're like, great, yes, thank you, more. You know, it's sort of interesting. On all these changes, they don't just go, wow, great, thanks, that was awesome, Gorbachev, we love you. They just say, okay, we want more. Like when people get a bit of freedom and liberty, there is a thirst for even more of that, where that came from. Glasnost is it just means openness, right? It's like an easing of censorship, right? Allowing opposition editorials in the newspaper. How about that? Maybe even allowing opposition newspapers, allowing the media to even mildly criticize the government, just a little bit, right? I mean, this is like a whole game changer. And Gorbachev basically says, look, like, there's such pressure building, we can't keep the lid on this thing unless he's thinking these will be a pressure valve. All right, that's his thought. These will be pressure valve moves. But what the response to them indicates is that there is such demand among the human beings living in the Soviet Union and in the satellite states for them, that as soon as like they get the sense that like the door is being opened even an inch, there's just, imagine the millions of people like blasting the door down. They want out. And we see a lot of that energy really culminating in the momentous events of 1989. So many things happened in 1989. Now, we've already learned about one that was really ugly, the one exception, and that is the events in Tiananmen Square. But even those are thematically tied to what we're going to see here. All right. So in 89, Poland is allowed to hold free elections. All right. They've made the most noise. Gorbachev is going to allow some free elections, and here's Gorbachev's key moment. Right. In those summer months, it's like, so they've elected non-communist leaders. We could either roll in the tanks, like what they're doing in China right now this summer. We can roll in the tanks and say, oh, never mind, we're going to put our people back in place and prop them up back in power, or we can let them go. What's it going to be? Gorbachev, to his credit, says, let him go. This happens non-violently in Poland, in all kinds of Eastern Bloc countries, one after the next. And then, of course, the magical moment happens in November of 1989, when the East German government is in these wave of elections, in the process of being voted out of power. They tell their own guards at the Berlin Wall to stand down. All right, no use guarding this thing anymore. They stand down. The public very quickly gets a sense of like the guards are leaving their posts, and there is a spontaneous gathering in Berlin on both sides of the wall as people are approaching it now, and then crowds begin to sort of take sledgehammers to the wall, and the people themselves take the Berlin Wall down and rip down the symbol of the iron wall divide between communism and freedom. There is a very definitive winner, that the public who lived under this did not want to live under that type of totalitarian control. And not long after that, the Soviet Union itself officially disbands, and Gorbachev, for all of his reforms, is suddenly out of a job. Here we see a McDonald's opening up in the former Soviet Union. You know, who could imagine such a thing? And that's not to say everything has been hunky-dory, right, in Russia today or the former Soviet states, but overwhelmingly, people in those places say life is better than it was under the Soviet system. So that's the end of one thing. What replaced it? Well, I'd say if there's any kind of framework or like overall story of the world today, it would be just the story of globalization, right? Globalization just means like a single global network of trade, a single global network of labor, right? Who's doing the work, and a single global network of markets. Rather than all these sort of pockets of trade networks that were sort of like regional, and then they're interregional, how about that? And then like they're crossing oceans, and they're getting bigger and bigger. Now it's just like everything's connected to everybody at every time, all right? That's the place we've gone to. Now a company can have a presence, they can sell their goods all over the world, they can have people building their goods all over the world, they can move goods around cheaply and quickly and easily. And this is all driven by technology, all right? You know, the information technology, the internet that's allowing us to do class distance learning. I mean, this is all globalization. The COVID-19 virus made possible by globalization, all right? So like the internet, these massive, massive, massive ships that can transport things across the ocean in bulk and for very cheap, robotics, robots with the internet, all this stuff. Like this sort of makes possible this sort of massive interconnected network. And so a company like I don't know, Coca-Cola, just to pick one that's on here, they can see the entire planet as one. We'll produce our stuff wherever it's the cheapest to produce it, and we'll sell our stuff wherever we can find markets to do it. And the general principle that promotes all this, what governments tend to do, for their part, what governments tend to do is they say, we will not have trade restrictions, right? We will keep low the tariffs, that's like taxes on trade, in hopes of just keeping everything moving. Because when things move, that's good economically, right? And customers can get cheap stuff, and companies can move stuff for cheap, and so governments say, we will stay out of the way. That's most governments, most of the time. There are exceptions. Real quickly, pause this video. Take a look around. Look at the clothes you're wearing, right? Look at, here's my slippers here. Made in Vietnam. Okay, see where your shoes are made. See where your clothes are made. Grab stuff in immediate reach. Do you have anything made in the United States? I doubt you do. Most of the stuff you've got made is made in Southeast Asia or East Asia, sometimes Latin America. We're living in globalization, right? Like that's all just markers of this, all right? And if you're someone that's like, well, I don't like that, I'd say, do you like cheap stuff? When you go shopping, do you intentionally buy things that are more expensive, or do you buy things that are cheaper? Do you like having TVs that are better than ever and also cheaper than ever? Do you like having cars that are better than ever and also more affordable than ever before, especially for the quality you're getting? Then you like globalization. That's part of how the cheap stuff happens, right? Cheap stuff. We all like cheap stuff, right? Everybody does. Globalization does funny things, though. You know, it's like even in the year 1900, right? You could take snapshots of people from around the world and find them all dressed in remarkably different ways. Today, you know, I'm wearing jeans and a t-shirt and like a dress shirt here. This is pretty much the norm around the planet, you know, with just a couple exceptions. You know, that's like homogenization of culture. No matter where you go, I can drink my Diet Coke. No matter where I go, I can find a Kentucky Fried Chicken, right? Even in China. I can find stuff I want to eat, right? Things are all becoming more homogenous. There are more and more languages disappearing every day. People speak fewer and fewer languages. English becomes a language that people speak around the world, right? But even then, it goes all kinds of ways, right? It's not like everyone's becoming more like us. I mean, then I can drive over to Qdoba or go to Chipotle and get burritos, right? And Americans, even in America, you hear more and more different kinds of languages than ever before, right? It's sort of like things are this sort of like massive global melting pot in a sense, right? Some things are going away, right? And certainly the biggest ingredients in this global melting pot tend to come from the United States, but it's all becoming one stew. Maybe it's tasty, maybe you think that, or maybe you're just like, it's a sludge. I like the world better when every place was so different and distinct, and I don't like how, homogenous things are now. And I'd say, well, okay. That's fair. That's a cost of globalization. But how to turn it back? Gosh, I don't know. It's like people who say, I don't like how American cars used to be made by American workers. Darn it. We should have those American jobs come back. And I'll say, they're not. They're not going to come back. Unless Americans suddenly decide they want more expensive cars, it's not going to come back. Also, it's not going to come back because half those jobs are done with robots now. It's like technology has changed everything. Globalization just disrupts stuff. If you like things the way they were 10 years ago, I'm sorry, but it's all going to change, right? And that rate of change is speeding up more and more and more now. And so that's kind of our stopping point. This is like in the trolley of AP World History, or in our boat. Maybe let's use our Deep Hope boat. I'll have to name that one for next year, the Deep Hope boat. But it's like, here's our last port, right? Here we're getting off. So many of the trends we've looked at throughout the year are culminating here. What are we gaining? What are the costs? Where will this lead? What have you seen? These are some of the things I'm going to ask you to reflect upon. And I'll tell you what, guys, if you're asking me like what is really going to shape my life the most going forward, this concept of globalization is in the middle of shaping it. We're all at home right now because of a disease that has spread more rapidly than any disease ever due to globalization. So, what do you think of these questions? You'll be asked to share some reactions. We're not done together in our journey. Of course, we're going to be reviewing, but we are done with the novelty and the fun of exploring new territory. And it's been a good journey. It's been great. So I'm looking forward to review. But for now, let's just savor the moment that we got here. Great job, guys. I'll see you soon.